So let's dig in a little bit. I have to ask you, and this is somewhat personal on behalf of a lot of people who follow you, who have a great respect for you. You were nominated after Ambassador Richard Grenell for the U.S. Ambassador to Germany. What happened with that? Because some of us were hoping that you would actually get a post within President Trump's administration much earlier than it actually happened.
Yes, well, for a variety of reasons, after I met with the president about serving in the Pentagon at the time, this would have been around the 20th of April of last year, he concluded that the opposition to my appointment to the Pentagon was so great in the Senate Armed Services Committee that simply was no way to do it, and he wanted very much to bring me into the administration. And on reviewing my background, he noticed that I speak very fluent German, like a German, and that I had lived in Germany off and on for 8 years, studied there, exchange student there all the way back to 1969. So he said, let's send Macgregor initially to Germany. Mm-hmm. But as we know, we didn't win the election. At least President Trump was not inaugurated again, let's put it that way.
Yes.
And as a result, he was very frustrated, and he said, well, I've got to get him into the Pentagon because there's some things I'd like to accomplish before I leave. And so I was called into the White House, and he gave me some tasks to perform, the most important of which was to set up the immediate departure of U.S. forces from Afghanistan to be rapidly followed by those in Iraq and Syria. And as I'm sure your listeners know, that did not come to fruition.
Sure.
Even though, it was the right thing to do, and it was a great time to do it. He understood that this was in the middle of the winter in Afghanistan, and if you're going to pick a time to withdraw from the country, that's ideal for the purpose, because most of your potential opponents are effectively snowed in the mountains and valleys of the country. So there's less likelihood of what we saw happening. That was the first thing. And then secondly, that we went back and looked at the numbers of people and equipment and these kinds of things and determined about 6 to 7 weeks would be enough time to get us out. But then many, many opponents of withdrawal descended on the president from the Senate as well as within his own administration. And as I like to point out, people say, well, what about the Trump administration? I said, well, the truth is there really wasn't a Trump administration. There was just Donald Trump.
Wow.
He had so many people appointed to key positions who were utterly opposed to everything that he wanted to do. It's really a miracle he was able to do very much at all. So he was talked out of it, and instead of pulling everything out, the force was reduced to 2,500 and left for the successor to determine what he wanted to do. And of course, the Biden administration, doesn't seem to have thought through any of it very clearly, didn't understand the timelines involved, and certainly picked the worst time of year you can imagine to conduct a withdrawal.
So speaking of that, let's unpack that withdrawal, because we have witnessed a debacle, essentially, an embarrassment on the global stage of our troops. And I thank you for your wonderful service, not just in the military, but also in the service of President Trump's administration. What contingencies were left in place that you obviously were directly involved with that were not followed clearly by President Biden's administration? This should not have happened.
Well, obviously, but the point is that the new administration, when it swept into the building, effectively expelled everyone that had any connection to the Trump administration and washed its hands of anything that had happened under Donald Trump. And I think over time they discovered that, the president was actually right about disengaging from most of the overseas commitments.
Absolutely.
And as a result, I think President Biden and his inner circle decided, well, after all, we really ought to get out. And I think you're going to witness over the next year or so more withdrawals from more places. The problem is there is no coherent strategy for any of it. There is no systematic planning underway as far as I can tell. The focus is almost entirely internal, and that focus, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, is on the armed forces itself and transforming them into a very strange organization with attitudes and values that bear no resemblance to anything that I would call American. So that's another problem. But
yes.
For the moment, I think what we saw in Afghanistan is a pretty good snapshot of very confused and incoherent thinking at the top, and the legacy of 30 years of what I would call bad selections for senior officers, a highly politicized officer corps at the top, and a force that is not ready to take on anybody who is really organized, trained, and equipped to fight. We've had it, frankly, over the last 20 years, certainly very, very easy. We haven't confronted anybody with a real Army, Air Force, air defenses. And the Army is not prepared, neither is the Marine Corps, in my judgment, to fight anybody who can really fight back.
Wow. So you mentioned that other problem, and I'd like to bring up a piece you wrote for the American Conservative in May of this year, transforming the military to transform the country. And that is precisely that problem that we seem to be facing with our military, starting with General Milley. We are really baffled by the statements that have been coming out of the Pentagon. Is the mission of the military to nation build and to dabble in social issues? And what is this transformation that you, in fact, talk about?
Well, you just asked a very important question. I think the transformation that the administration wants to make is to convert the country into something it doesn't want to be. It's some sort of Marxist, multinational, multicultural, multilingual, just go down the list, sort of a Marxist version of Austria-Hungary. And that's a prescription, of course, for national failure. It destroys national cohesion and makes us vulnerable to all sorts of problems. And the way to do that, of course, is to throw open your borders. They understand very well that no borders means no nation. So yes. The quickest way to destroy the nation is to simply open its borders to penetration by anybody who wants to come in. That's what we are witnessing on the southern border. At the same time, a failure at home to enforce the law, whether it's in Chicago or Philadelphia or anywhere else. Attorneys general who are Soros-backed individuals who are committed to essentially tolerating criminality on a grand scale and then organizing people to attack citizens and property. All of these things we saw in the run-up to the election, and we're seeing them again. And I think the idea is to fundamentally destroy what is left of the United States of America, its institutions, its national identity, its history, its culture. But this is nothing new. Anyone who has lived in the countries of Eastern Europe that used to be part of the so-called Soviet bloc are familiar with the process.
Absolutely.
If you could destroy the history and culture, eliminate any understanding of identity, then in theory you can change everything to suit your purpose. This was the Bolshevik idea that people like Lenin and Trotsky and others conceived of. The problem is it doesn't work, and it won't work in the United States. People are not fungible. People have souls. People are spiritual as well as physical human beings. Their heritage is deeply rooted in them. And I don't need to explain that in great detail to someone like you, but I think there is a failure in the administration to understand that. I mean, the joke in Moscow was the day the Soviet Union collapsed, everyone looked around and said, well, where are all the Soviet men and women? There were none. What you had were Russians, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Belarusians, Uzbeks, Tajiks. Gee, what a surprise.
Absolutely.
So this is what's happening inside the United States, and I think it's just the road to conflict and crisis, which is now probably inevitable. It's unfortunate. But, the first institution you want to get control of is, of course, the military and the police.
Sure.
These were the things that Lenin used to call the organs of power. If you can control them, in theory, then you can bully people, you can intimidate people, you can push them into things. And now, with the added support of the media, which behaves almost as though it were a state-owned enterprise, you can misinform, mislead, and manage opinion, or at least that's what people think. Again, I don't see that working simply because of the internet and the enormous opportunities for human beings to learn the truth, whether or not the government wants it to reach them. So, I think that's it in a nutshell. I think we're in for now months and years of crisis and conflict in the United States, but in the end, the American people will prevail.